Thank you so much for doing this, Willem. And this is also one of my first interviews. So, pardon me if I'm all over the place. And
No worries, Ro. It's a
uh,
pleasure.
yeah, um, as we were just discussing, I discovered Shrimp Insights, your website, your publication, and your data consultancy that you run.
Mm,
I think you do a spectacular job. And
mm,
as I learned, as I discovered, there are many people who are benefiting from what you do. So
mm.
yeah, thanks for doing that and sticking to it. I don't know, you've been doing this for more than I think 12 years now.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
super cool. Um,
Mm. Thanks.
so my questions are going to be just for the perspective for investors based out of India, and obviously we'd want a global perspective, and
Yeah.
also where India lies, um, within that overall global perspective. So
Yeah.
let's start off with the first question. India has been hit by massive tariffs. Uh, I believe the figure is 26% plus 10%. Ecuador is relatively much better at 10%, and Vietnam and a lot of Indonesia are probably higher. Um, what do you see? How are you assessing this? How do you see this impacting various countries?
I think it's honestly still um, very early to speculate, right? Because we have no clue about how Trump and his administration is going into negotiations. We don't know which turn those negotiations will take. We don't
Right.
know whether they will go for like overall reductions of like universal tariffs for a country, or whether they will go on a commodity by commodity basis. I've also heard through channels that there's a big lobby in the US to actually exclude food from the tariffs. So
Right.
there's, I think, still a lot of uncertainty on how exactly this is gonna play out, right?
Right.
But of course, like if you assume that at least for, let's say, the next year or so, these are the tariffs that the shrimp industry has to deal with, I think there will be some major changes, right? Although we also have to keep in mind, like especially a country like India has huge cold store capacity, not only in India but also in the US, right? So there might still be substantial inventories in the US, which will allow the Indian companies keep going for some time, right? And the question is, of course, like how quickly is that correction of prices, etc., going to happen, and what will happen in the meanwhile? Yeah. So, but clearly, like if you, I think I just published an overview because I thought it's not only about the reciprocal tariffs, right? There was already a disbalance in tariffs due to the
Yeah, the
anti-dumping and
CVD.
countervailing duties, right? So if you look at that list, like I ordered it on like the total amount of tariff, right? Vietnam is at almost a 75%
Yeah,
tariff rate, right?
insane.
That's
Yeah.
that's killing, right? Sri Lanka was at 0, is now going to 44. Sri Lanka is exporting to the US, right? Like it's a small country, but it's exporting. Bangladesh 37%, Thailand 36%, Indonesia 32%, India, oh, sorry, and I was reading the wrong line. So Indonesia 36%, India 34%, Ecuador only
Right.
14%.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
you have a whole list of smaller
Mhm.
suppliers like Argentina, Honduras, Guatemala, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Peru, and so on, which only have that 10%, right? So yeah, clearly, if this is gonna last for some time, surely the companies or the countries with lower tariffs will be attempting to profit from the higher tariffs of others, right? But it's also not so easy, right? Like Ecuador cannot suddenly produce 200,000 tons extra peeled shrimp, right? They don't have the capacity to do that, I think.
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and that there are, the relationships between retailers and food service companies are built over a decade, right? So this will not change overnight. It will also take time before importers exporters and their market distribution partners will take different decisions, will sign new contracts, and yeah, so it's really, I think, very early to speculate. But if you just look at the big picture, from my perspective, Raoul, and sorry that I keep on talking, but you can interrupt me whenever you want.
No. I want you to. I'm enjoying. Please continue.
So I think it was already clear, like there was already a very clear dynamic happening in the shrimp industry in the international marketplace, which was driven by the growth of Ecuador, right? So Ecuador is growing very rapidly. As the total volume grows, also the volume of headless shell-on and peeled product grows. That actually grows faster than the head-on shell-on segment because they need to diversify markets away from Southern Europe and China. That meant that Asian suppliers in the US and in Northern Europe were already experiencing increased competition from Ecuador. They were already being challenged on their market shares. You can see that very clearly in import statistics that Ecuador in the US especially had already taken over that headless shell-on market to a very big extent. And then, like if you think that through, what happens, right? So Ecuador comes in, then India comes in, right? And India is dominating the peeled market in the US and the value-added market in the US. So if India is challenged in those market segments, what will it do? It will push into the market segments where Ecuador is not competing that much yet, right? Which is mainly cooked and other value-added products. Who were the main suppliers there? Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. And that is my main question, right? Okay, so Ecuador pushes in, which forces India to pivot, which forces Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam to pivot. But where will they pivot to, right? Because how much space will there remain for these countries in the market? And then you go, of course, into this domestic market narrative where people say, oh, the Asian producers need to develop domestic market, but that will not happen overnight because you need infrastructure, you need affordability, you need people wanting to eat shrimp, and all of this is not something that happens from one day to the other, right? So to be honest, I think India, yes, it's bad for India. It will, if this does not change, it will have a very negative impact on the performance of the Indian industry, at least in the short term. But I think India is not worse off, right? I think countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam are in a much worse position. And that leads, and we can speak about it more maybe a bit later, but like I think India was already making these investments, right? So Indian processors were already investing in value-added plants. Cooking, yes, but cooking was already there a bit longer. But then marinating plants and plants for further value-added products, right? Like battered and dusted and breaded shrimp products, and that trend was already happening and now will only accelerate, right? And the other two trends that were already happening is that Indian companies started to invest in fish processing capacity, right? So positioning India as a reprocessing hub for whitefish, maybe for salmon, to compete with China, for example, and the same for tilapia, right? And you could say, well, yes, okay, but also those products are hit by the tariffs, yes, but China is much and much worse hit than India is. So India has increased its competitiveness to China, right? So I think that, and that's often my conclusion. It's very easy to speak about winners and losers in terms of countries, but in the end, I think there will really be winners and losers within the countries. And then there will be a group of companies that have pivoted their businesses in such a way that actually, even with this new development, they might remain resilient for the future, right?
Got it. So I think you made an interesting point, and just to kind of reiterate whether I've understood you correctly, what you said was that Ecuador already has a somewhat advantageous position versus India, right? Given that they have a higher share, given they're geographically closer, and given that they have a lower, tariff rates. Did I get that part right? The first part?
Well, not entirely, you know, like you have to understand the core of the Ecuador industry, right? Like the Ecuador industry is set up to be a head-on, shell-on
Got it.
exporter, right? Which means that they treat the product and they process the product to export it as a bulk head-on, shell-on product, primarily to China, but also to cookers in Europe, right?
Right.
But you can imagine that if you harvest a pond of shrimp, a certain amount of product that will not have that head-on, shell-on quality, right? Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 15%. So that product needs to be processed and sold as headless shell-on and peeled products, right? So I always jokingly say, like in Ecuador, headless shell-on is a leftover product, and peeled is a leftover of the leftover product, right? So, and that story started to change slightly at the moment that Ecuador's exports started to grow that fast that even all that material that could be sold as head-on, shell-on, there was no demand for that, right? So there was an even bigger need for the Ecuadorian companies to diversify their markets into headless shell-on and peeled markets.
Right.
But in terms of competitiveness, if we wouldn't have all these tariffs, it would be very hard for Ecuador to compete on the processing, right? They are very competitive on the farming side, but on the processing side, if you speak about labor-intensive products, Asia still had a very competitive edge, but that competitive edge is definitely disappearing.
Right, given
with this balance in tariffs, right?
Got it. So just to kind of for the benefit of people who might not understand exactly the difference between head-on, shell-on, and the other varieties, can you just give us a very
easy? So you have the whole shrimp with head, with bill, with shell. That is what we call head-on, shell-on.
Right.
Then you have something we call headless shell-on. So you still have the bill, you still have the shell, but the head is taken off.
And
then you have a headless shell-on easy peel. So then they cut the back open so that you can peel it easily once it is in the restaurant.
Right.
And then you have a peeled product, right? And with the peeled product, they take off not only the head, but they also take off the shell. And they have all kind of peels. You can have a tail on, tail off, deveined, undeveined, cut deveined, undeveined. That's quite unique to shrimp. I think investors won't realize, right? But normally with chicken, you have maybe 5 or 6 SKUs in the supermarket,
right?
If you look at the range of specifications and the range of sizes of shrimp, it is so diverse, which makes shrimp much more complicated in terms of product specifications than any other protein.
Right. It's really very fascinating because initially you just think, hey, like it's a shrimp, but then the more you learn about it, there's just so much depth into the product. But so is it also correct for me to understand that the more you process it, the higher the price of the product? So for example, if you have
yes, but not necessarily the margin, right? So yes.
Right, because you need labor to kind of do the processing also.
So the higher value added, the higher the price, but also because there's more shrimp going into a kilogram, right? So we always use something that what we call live weight equivalent.
Right.
So it means that like if you have a final product, if it's peeled, you do factor 0.6 to get to a live weight equivalent. So you lose 40% of the weight, more or less 35 or 40%, depending on the species, depending on the genetics. You lose that when you take off the head and the shell and the tail.
Right.
So a headless shell-on is 80% of a head-on shell-on. So that's also why the kilogram price increased, right? So you need more shrimp for a kilogram of product.
Makes sense. It makes sense. And now coming back to what you said about Ecuador, which was that Ecuador mainly exports the head-on, shell-on, and therefore they are not as value-added. But is that correct?
Yeah. So the funny thing is that even the definition of value addition is different between Latin America and Asia, right? So in Ecuador, they call everything that is not head-on shell-on, they call it value added. But if you talk to any processor in India, if you ask them, do you do value added? The least they speak about is, in that case, cooking, right? Or special sushi cuts, right? Like nobashi and all those things, or marinated or breaded or other ready-to-eat formats, right? So, and of course for Ecuador, because Ecuador is a dollar economy, so relatively speaking, it's a very expensive country to live in, but also salaries are very high. I believe that the minimum salary in Ecuador is around $700 per month, which is very high. So you can imagine that labor is very expensive. So that also makes that if Ecuador wants to really take on that peeled market at a larger scale, they will have to make very significant investments in automated peeling, for example. And this is what companies like Trump Machinery, a US company based in New Orleans, they are releasing over the next couple of months, like a new generation of shrimp peeling machines that can really help these Ecuadorian companies to, without labor, but with investment, actually be able to do larger volumes of peeled shrimp. Yeah, but the labor advantage of India, not only over Ecuador, but also over countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, is quite big. And that also makes that I say, like India will move into that value added. And then I mean everything more than cooked. India will move in that segment. It is happening, and it will take market share from other Asian producers that are more expensive on the labor side.
I think I read your deck also, where you shared a lot of data. I think it's 118 slides, and if anybody is looking to learn, they should definitely check it out. I'll include a link in the video for sure. There I noticed that now, I think of the total exports that India does, nearly about, there was huge growth in the so-called value-added product category, and we saw more than 50% in Q4. There was significant amounts of growth happening in that segment. So yeah, that's something that was interesting. Now I'll have to check where those exports are being done, but
it's primarily US and Canada. So value added from India is almost, I think, 80-90% going to the US.
Right. Okay.
But the thing is that there, and that's of course a whole different question. Is like, one question is what will happen between suppliers, right? Like who will benefit from. But the other question is what will happen with overall shrimp consumption, right? Because for the raw products, the US buyers can easily go to Ecuador and they can say, okay, give us your headless shell-on, give us your peeled.
All right.
But cooked and marinated and others are not readily available in those countries, right? So it's not that they have a lot of choice. Then they might say, okay, maybe domestic, yes, maybe to some extent they would do. So they would import raw material from overseas and they would do domestic value addition. That might happen.
Right. Yeah.
But also, of course, India can. And the question is like, one way or the other, prices will increase, right?
Yeah.
And what will that do with US consumption? I'm not enough of an economist to really explain that. You would have to talk to Angel Rubio at Urner Berry, for example, who will definitely be able to give you a perspective on that. But I think that's a big uncertainty, right? Like, okay, prices are going to increase. How sensitive is demand to price increase?
To price increases,
And what will that mean for the position of shrimp in the US as a category, right? Will that mean that people will shift to poultry, or will keep people eating it anyway because it was already a slightly more expensive protein than most of the other proteins? So does it? And this I really have to refer you to Angel, who can give you a very detailed opinion.
Yeah, I'd love to, if you can refer me to them. I'd love to have a conversation. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we don't really know whether how much the increase in prices will impact consumption to begin with. So that's
And then of course, like, my next question is, okay, so where will India then go, right? Okay, you can say China, headless shalom blocks, nice, big turnover in volume, but a very tricky market in the sense that the Chinese government policies can change from year to year. One year they might be supportive of imports, the other year they might be supportive of the domestic industry, which seems to be the case for the next couple of years.
right.
At the same time, India, China politics are also not the most stable, all you could say, right? So China is, yes, short term, yes, long term, it might be complicated. Then you could say, okay, what about the EU? Well, India is in the EU confronted with a very high percentage of checks because of the presence of antibiotics, 50% checks in the EU port, 100% checks in the Indian port. This is a heavy additional burden for European importers that are sourcing from India, because it is additional waiting times, additional costs, etc. Right? And in the EU, Vietnam has an FTA, Ecuador has an FTA. Where is the FTA between India and the EU, right? So also in the EU, India has, I think there's an opportunity to grow. But it's not so easy as it might look like from the outside, right? So, and that's why I think that this development into different species, whether it's monodon has much less competition than Vaname in the market. For monodon, India competes especially with Vietnam. It has a very strong position because it also has the Vaname. So, that's, I think, good opportunity. But in the end, the growth potential of monodon in India is relatively limited, right? Because you can only grow it in high salinity waters, which is coastal ponds. So like half of the ponds in Andhra Pradesh, maybe even 60-70%, are not suitable for monodon, right? So that option to shift is relatively limited. So the freshwater farms, they could more easily shift to tilapia, right? And tilapia is actually a product that is in high demand in the US, but also in other markets around the world. And China is really struggling to keep those markets because of the high tariffs, right? So I think, and then again, I go to that point, like those companies that are seeing those developments and making those investments, they are much less exposed to this volatility of the shrimp industry than others, right?
Right. Makes sense. There was another thing that kind of caught my eye, which was again from the deck that you shared, where the shrimp from Ecuador was around $7.50 to around $7 to $7.50. The rates at which they were exporting to the US in the second half of 2024, whereas in India those prices kind of bottomed out early 2024, and they were trending upwards from around 6 to 6.5. So already, based on the data that we have, India was supplying cheaper, shrimp. At least the numbers are there. I don't know whether that's the landed cost or not, or maybe.
No, I think I need to look at the graph, but probably I was comparing one product type with the other. So you need to be very careful that you compare apples with apples, right?
Right.
And not apples with pears. But in general, last year there was a very strong upward trend of prices from more or less mid last year towards end of last year, depending on the country. Right. And that's the tough thing for the shrimp industry, right? Like the shrimp industry went through one of the worst crises of the last decade. Extremely low prices last year across the world, right? It didn't matter where you went, like prices were really at an all-time low, especially if you would compensate for inflation, like it would look much worse than in my graphs where I don't correct for inflation, right? So prices were improving. I think the industry was really feeling kind of a relief. Volumes were being kept up in Ecuador and India, and now this, right? So yeah, I think it's tough days for
Yeah,
for the
I mean, it's been a very tough day because there's one of the largest feed companies, Avanti, is down 15%, I think, today, 15 or 20%.
I think 17% indeed.
Yeah. So massive drops. So yeah, it is interesting. But you mentioned that. Sorry, you want to add something?
So to say, for example, Avanti, right? I think that's also if you look within India, and I'm saying that because probably for your investor audience, it's interesting. So within India, the companies in Andhra Pradesh are much less diversified in their markets than the companies in Odisha, West Bengal, Gujarat. So most of the big companies in Andhra Pradesh, they probably have a dependency of anywhere between 70 and 90% on the US market, which is huge, right?
Yeah.
And that, I guess, also makes that the trust or the belief in these companies for the short term got like a big hit due to these announcements. Yeah.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point because I was also wondering, there are 2-3 companies, like there's a company called Sharath Industries, which I think is based out of Tamil Nadu, if I'm not wrong, and not in Andhra.
I think they are in Andhra. Their headquarters is in Tamil Nadu, but they are based in Nellore or Ongole, like in the. So within Andhra Pradesh, you have the central and the northern part with
just off the east coast on the lower side you have Andhra, and just below that you have Tamil Nadu.
No, but I mean within Andhra you have like 2 shrimp hubs basically, right? One is the one around Kakinada.
Okay.
So East Godavari, West Godavari, Krishna, and then you have one around Nellore. So that is Guntur, Nellore, and one other province, right? District. And these we operate quite independently from each other.
Right. I just read an article on that too, where you'd on your website. There was how much stocking has been done in all these various districts. So yeah, that was very interesting. Got it. So fine. So India is where it is right now, and from what I can sum up, it's kind of hard to obviously evaluate where the chips will land, so to speak, based on where we are. But you also mentioned that 2022, like I'm gonna maybe step back a little bit over the last, since 2022. You said that the shrimp industry had one of the worst periods. Could you maybe explain what had happened over there? Because a lot of commodities went through a similar kind of trend where 21 prices shot up. There was overstocking, and then the next 2 years were really bad. So could you just help us understand that?
Yeah, I think it had all to do with COVID, right? So I think when COVID started, you actually had an extreme price drop because the funny part is that India exports almost all its shrimp, right? But
we barely consume anything.
Yeah, but you are importing almost all of your broodstock, right? So when COVID hit and when logistics became challenging, transport lines from Florida and Hawaii to India got disrupted, right? Which meant that suddenly there was no broodstock anymore. I think at that moment there was kind of a panic situation, and prices dropped very fast due to panic harvests and a general belief that the industry would get disrupted for a longer period of time, right? So, but then what happened was that normally, I think with shrimp, the majority gets consumed in the out-of-home segment, right? So in the restaurants, in hotels, etc. But once COVID came and most countries
Went into lockdown. Yeah.
went into lockdown, restaurants closed, but
Mhm.
people started to eat shrimp at home.
Mm.
So what you have to keep in mind is that the companies that supply retail are normally not the same companies that supply wholesale,
Right.
because it's often a totally different kind of business, right? Where in wholesale is a lot of spot market, while in retail it's a lot of long-term contracts. You need to keep inventories, so
Mhm.
it's a different type of companies active in those segments, right? So
Right.
the companies in the retail segment started to buy very big amounts of shrimp,
Mhm.
driving up prices. But then at some point, of course, when we got towards the end of COVID and everything opened up again and people went back to the restaurants,
Mhm.
that consumption shifted again. So inventories were built in the wrong
Right.
place, right? So and I think that became clear only really at the end of COVID. When we were coming out of COVID, it became clear that we went into a very big oversupply situation, not the least because production in both Ecuador but also in India increased a lot, right, during those
Right.
years. So
Right.
and then prices collapsed. Yeah.
Right. And Ecuador had been growing, I mean, just very rapidly leading up to 2022, right?
Yes.
Ecuador was.
Yeah, so Ecuador was, I think, like what you have to keep in mind with Ecuador is that at some point, Chinese demand for head-on shell-on shrimp was so big that prices were very strong, and at the same time, Ecuador had made like real big steps in having genetics
Mhm.
that were disease tolerant, but that were also growing fast. And at the same time, because all the big international feed companies came in, better nutrition became available. The feed companies pushed for automated feeding. So
Mhm.
aerators were installed in ponds, auto feeders were installed, and that allowed the Ecuadorian farmers to actually double their productivity. And that is what has been happening over the past few years, is that one farm after the other got technified, doubling the production capacity
Mm.
and resulting in that increase of production. But at the same time, huge consolidation, right? Because
Right.
farms that were independent or farms that didn't technify, they increasingly struggled to survive in these market conditions. While the scale of the big Ecuadorian companies, I believe that Santa Priscilla has last year done around 300,000 tons. Can you imagine the biggest Indian companies did 30,000 tons, right? So the top five in Ecuador is doing more than 100,000 tons each, right? So
Massive.
the top five together is probably doing almost the whole Indian production,
Yeah, the
right? So
whole. Yeah.
that
Yeah. So
level
we.
of that level of consolidation is very extreme, and that makes that
Right.
the companies have a lot of power. But again, like Ecuador in the end is not a producer of value-added shrimp. Yes, it will grow because it has to, but if it could, it would just focus on head-on, shell-on, because that is where their competitive edge is the
Mm.
biggest. If all of these tariffs would not be there.
Right. Right. Got it. And since one of the narratives that was coming out was that Ecuador was having issues, power issues over the last, couple of maybe 1 or 2 years, and because of that, their supply was a little bit, taking a hit, and that's where India was in a slightly better position, and therefore, I mean that was the kind of
Yeah,
commentary
but
that was coming.
but I think it's also true, because if you look at I think the big power challenges in Ecuador have been solved since the end of last year.
Okay.
And immediately you see a surge in year-on-year productivity in January and February, right? I believe a 14% and a 20% year-over-year increase
Right.
in those 2 months. So like already before the tariffs were announced, like I predicted, like Ecuador production will probably grow with at least 5 to 15% this year, probably closer to 10, 15 than to the 5%, right? So that was going to happen anyway, and it will only be strengthened now.
Right. Yeah. So what you're saying, or what I'm understanding from what you're saying, is that a lot of the issues that Ecuador was facing have largely been addressed. The power issues have been addressed. There's a lot of consolidation. Therefore, if anything, they should be more competitive. And they're kind of out of that trouble zone, so to speak. Would that be about right?
Yes, but keep in mind, like, competitiveness of Ecuador on value-added products
Is
is
for a
not.
different category of, yes, absolutely. That's a point
Yeah,
well
so
noted.
the competitiveness lies in the head-on shell-on. For the other products, without these tariffs,
Hmm.
I would doubt how competitive Ecuador would be.
Okay. And so coming to India, how, are we competitive in a different segment, and how competitive are we versus, other countries? Can you help us
Yeah,
understand
so
that?
I think at the farm level, production costs in most of the countries are not so different, right? Like, production costs become volatile depending on the amount of disease that the farmer is dealing with, because that will impact the growth rate, it will impact the FCR. So production costs can go up very rapidly if you have a successful crop, right? But if you have a successful crop, production costs from one country to the other are not that different. So a big part of the competitiveness is in processing, and there India definitely has a strong competitive edge over Ecuador, but also over most of the other Asian producers.
Mm-hmm.
And that is again what my belief is that in the more value-added products, so raw peeled, cooked peeled, marinated, breaded, etc.,
Yeah.
India, I think, will actually have a pretty good road ahead. Yeah, and then on that tilapia story, because of the situation of China,
Mm-hmm.
India is also not in a very bad place.
Got it.
I
Got it.
would think, yes. So yes, it's challenging. It's
Mm-hmm.
what we started with, Rahul, right? Yes, it's a terrible situation. It will be challenging. It will be tough years.
Right.
But there are others that are in an even worse place.
Yeah, was there are a lot of PDFs and articles coming through that were talking about the relative advantage in terms
Well,
of,
and I think that's like whether it's unfair or not. But
yeah,
that's like if I get sentimental, my
absolutely.
primary response is like, this is unfair, right? Like, what is this based on, right? Like, Argentina is a highly protectionist country, right? Why are they at 10%, and why is Switzerland, which is a free trade nation without any tariffs for whosoever, why are they sanctioned so toughly, right? Like, it seems. I read a news article today that even Rabobank, which is one of the biggest agricultural banks worldwide, is kind of saying like, hey, has this list not been made with ChatGPT, right? Like, so yeah, so from the sentimental side, it feels very unfair how this is done, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, more than more than being sentimental, it's just a very interesting situation to be in, and even absurd to some extent, because normal logic would indicate that if you raise tariffs, you are essentially taxing your own citizens. Would that be? I mean,
Yeah.
what do you think about that? Like, isn't at the end of the day, the American citizen they're going to end up paying a lot higher. It's not like, you know, so yeah, I don't. I mean, it's just interesting.
True, but it's tough to look into his mind, right? Like, yeah, maybe he's fine with everyone eating chicken. Uh, I don't know. It's
Yeah, true. But yeah, super interesting. Do we have much time left?
I don't think so, Rahul. I think we are almost done.
Well, you've been very generous with your time. I'll just take one last question. This is kind of selfish because, again, I have a small investment in Avanti Feeds for disclosure. And I was just trying to understand, so with feed companies, obviously, I mean, the more stocking that happens on the farm level,
Yeah.
the more likely it is that farmers are going to obviously need feed, right? And that is why your article on the stocking levels, that was very interesting to me. So if you want to get some sort of lead indicator as to how feed companies are going to perform, and you have a global view, is there a way to kind of understand beforehand? Are there any lead indicators to kind of understand, I mean, how feed companies are possibly going to perform?
That's a tough one, Raoul, right? Like, I think, like a full disclosure, also, I work as an advisor to Galaxy. You already mentioned the satellite data that can
Right, yeah.
or at least monitor real time how much ponds are stocked and for how many days. And based on that, people can see like what is available in the market, right? And how does that compare to previous years? So you can make kind of an historical analysis, which will allow you to have a better understanding of the actual situation, rather than depending on trade data and having to calculate back, right? So I do think that like this type of intelligence of Galaxy or other companies that can provide similar services will really help you to have a better understanding today of what the situation will be in 3 months, right? Because what they can do, and then like when I studied myself, like the annual reports of the top 20 Indian companies, which I recently did, first of all, I was surprised by the performance in general, because it was much less worse than I had expected based on what people thought about the situation in India last year with the low prices, right? So I think actually the figures of most of the companies were not that bad at all, right? But then you could see a very clear difference between the performance of the feed companies and that were also processing and exporting, and companies that were only processing and exporting. So you could see that the big hits are taken on processing and not necessarily on feed bills. So it's probably the farmers that suffer, it's the processors that suffer, but it's the feed companies that actually are able to manage the situation in a less problematic way.
So just to, even within the same company, because Avanti has around 15% of their exports, which are processed shrimp, we're seeing that segment, the margins are shrinking, whereas in the feed segment, they're expanding. So that was also interesting, and I mean that dichotomy is visible even on on a company's levels. What you're saying. So
I think that companies, like if you look within the Indian ecosystem, I would say that that companies like Avanti, Devi Seafoods, Sanja Marine, Sanja Aqua are in a very good position, while companies like Apex,
very good. Coastal Corporation, you have
exactly, they are in a much more problematic situation because they only have the processing, right? So
right, makes sense. Perfect. Thank you so much. This has been amazing, and I mean,
maybe if I can take one opportunity to tell to your audience that we are organizing the biggest shrimp conference in the world in the Netherlands, of all places. You might ask why the Netherlands, but it is because like it's easy to reach from whatever place in the world. Our event is the 2nd to the 4th of September. All major shrimp players are there, from Ecuador, from Asia, from North America, and from Europe. If you are investing in shrimp, I strongly recommend you to take the plane to Utrecht and spend 3 days with us, September 2nd to 4th.
Actually, that would be amazing. Actually, we've got a few months. I think we're in April now. I wish I can. I hope I can make it. And I'd love to kind of come meet you in person. And
that would be great.
And absolutely. And to everyone else as well, I highly recommend checking out Willem's website, Shrimp Insights. I think it's a treasure trove for people who are trying to learn more about the industry. Thank you so much for doing this, Willem, and thank you for the website. I think it's really amazing. Cool.
Thanks for reaching out, and good luck with your podcast. And I'm looking forward to listen back to our conversation.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Really.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks, Robin. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Cheers.